Right now, one of your hands is doing all the real work. The other one just holds things steady. You never sat down and chose that. It feels like a question we should have answered by now. We haven't, but what we have found is genuinely strange. Your dominant hand was chosen for you before you took your first breath. Roughly 1 in 10 people are left-handed, and that number has barely moved in 500,000 years. No group of humans anywhere has ever been mostly left-handed. Not one tribe, not one country, not one single corner of the map. And no other animal on Earth does this the way we do. Not even chimpanzees, our closest cousins, lean this hard to one side. Something in your brain is quietly pushing almost all of us toward the same hand. And here is the part that should stop you. Doctors can tell which hand you will use before you are even born. They watch the unborn baby on the ultrasound. They see which hand it keeps lifting toward its own mouth. Whichever hand wins that little contest in the womb, that is the hand you will reach with for the rest of your life. Once that pattern locks in, it almost never flips. Now, where does the 500,000 years come from? It comes from old bones. The arm you use most gets a little longer, a little denser, a little stronger, just from a whole lifetime of doing the work. So when archaeologists dig up ancient skeletons, they can read the dominant arm straight off the bone. And about 1 in 10 of those ancient people were left-handed too. Exactly the same ratio as the world outside your window today. Then there are the teeth. In a cave in Croatia, scientists found a Neanderthal who died long ago, about 130,000 years before you were born. Their front teeth were covered in tiny scratches, and the scratches all leaned the same way. Here is what those scratches were doing there. That Neanderthal was cleaning an animal hide to wear as clothing. They bit down on one edge of the hide to hold it tight. They pulled it steady with one hand, and scraped it clean with a sharp gray stone in the other. Sometimes the stone slipped and grazed their own front teeth, and the direction of that slip tells us which hand held the tool. Again and again, across the whole fossil record, the answer is the right hand. And it goes back even further than that. A relative of ours from nearly 2 million years ago left the very same scratch pattern on its teeth. This was before language, before farming, before any art we have ever found. And our family was already favoring the right. Even the cave paintings are gray. On rock walls in Europe, in Indonesia, in Argentina, ancient artists pressed one hand flat to the stone, and blue-colored powder around it to leave an outline. Almost all of those outlined hands are left hands, which means the hand doing the steady work, holding the pigment, was the right. So this is not some recent quirk. This goes deep, and it was never really a choice you made. You did not pick your dominant hand the way you picked a favorite color. And here is where it gets even stranger. Identical twins share the exact same DNA, and they can still end up with different dominant hands. About 1 in 4 identical twin pairs split this way. So your genes alone do not decide it, but your genes do load the dice. If both your parents are right-handed, you have about a 10% chance of being left-handed. If one parent is left-handed, your odds climb to roughly 17. And if both parents are left-handed, it jumps to around 26. There's even a small gap between men and women. Men are slightly more likely to be left-handed. And honestly, researchers still are not sure why. The best guess is that there is no single gene for being left-handed. Instead, there is a tiny tendency that scientists nickname the right shift. Here is how it works. Your brain is cross-wired. The left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain controls the left. Now here is the strange overlap. In almost every right-hander, language lives on the left side of the brain, in a small region first mapped by a French scientist in the 1860s. So the same half that runs your strong hand also runs your speech. And right beside it sits a patch that lights up when you make and use tools. Hand control, language, and tool use, all crowding onto the same side. That crowding together is exactly what the right shift creates. If you carry the shift, your strong hand and your speech both go left, and you end up right-handed. If you do not carry the shift, your brain gets no clear instruction, and your body simply picks a side more or less by chance. So here is the twist nobody expects. Left-handedness is not really a gene for being left-handed. It is the absence of the instruction to be right-handed. But why the right hand and not the left? The clue might be older than tools. It might come from the day our ancestors stood up on two legs. Strangely, kangaroos walk upright too. And they are almost the only other mammal that leans hard to one side like us. But kangaroos lean the opposite way. Most of them are left-handed, which hints at something deeper. Standing upright frees the hands, and a freed-up brain has to pick a side, no matter what species you happen to be. Which leaves one obvious question hanging. If being right-handed is the default the whole species drifted toward, why are there any lefties left at all? Why has that 10% never just faded away? The answer comes from somewhere you would never expect. It comes from sports. Among the greatest hitters in baseball history, roughly half of them swing left-handed. Out of a world where lefties are only 1 in 10. The same pattern shows up in boxing, in fencing, in tennis, in cricket, in the cage. A study looked at thousands of professional fights and found that left-handed fighters win far more often than they should. Not because they are stronger, but simply because they are rare. Think about what that does to an opponent. You grow up training against right-handers year after year, so your reflexes get tuned for right-handed attacks. Their punches come from the angle you expect. Then a lefty steps in, and everything is suddenly mirrored. You are off by a fraction of a second, and in a fight, that fraction is everything. It is the line between landing a punch and eating one. The logic underneath it is simple. When a thing is rare, being that rare thing is an advantage. And the moment it becomes common, the advantage quietly disappears. That is why the number stays stuck near 10%. If too many people were lefties, the surprise would die, and the edge would vanish. If too few were lefties, the genetic odds would push the number back up. So 10% is a balance point that evolution keeps returning to. But there is a second pressure pulling the other way. Because most of life is not a fight. Most of life is cooperation. Sharing tools, copying what the person next to you is doing. And almost every tool, going all the way back, was built for the majority. Scissors, can openers, school desks, guitars, even the way cards get dealt around a table. And look at golf. Only about 4% of top golfers are left-handed. Because in golf, you are not facing an opponent. You are alone against the course. There is no surprise to gain, only right-handed gear to fight against. So when you go head-to-head, being a lefty is a gift. But when you share the tools, being a lefty is a daily nuisance. The 10% you see is just those two forces balancing, generation after generation, quietly settling at the same number. And there is one more strange thing about left-handed brains. In most people, the two halves of the brain split the work very strictly. Language sits almost entirely on the left. Picturing things, reading faces, knowing where you are, all sit on the right. The two sides rarely cross over. Lefties are wired a little differently. The jobs that stay locked to one side in a righty often get shared across both sides in a lefty, and that wiring quietly changes things. When the speech part of the brain gets injured, lefties often recover their words faster, because the other half can step in and take over. The two halves of a lefty's brain also talk to each other a little quicker. And on tasks that pull from many places at once, lefties edge ahead a little. The psychologist who spent his life studying this put it gently. A left-hander's brain is just a little more spread out, a little less strict about which side does what. It is not a superpower. Plenty of lefties are wonderfully ordinary. But across a whole population, the wiring really is a bit different. Now think about how the world has treated that difference. The old Latin word for left is sinister. We still use it today to mean something evil. The French word for left also means clumsy and awkward. And in English, your right hand is the skillful one. Being right even came to mean being correct. So for most of history, left-handed children were forced to switch. Teachers tied their left hands behind their backs. Pens were slapped out of their hands. In some places, this went on into the 1960s. And it almost never worked. Because the brain had already chosen, long before anyone tried. The brain was never negotiating. You did not decide which hand would be yours. Your brain picked a side before you took your very first breath. following a pattern that is held for 500,000 years. So look down at your hands for a moment. The hand you wave with, the hand you write with. That hand is older than every city ever built. Older than writing, older than the first spoken word. And if you are one of the rare few who reaches with the other hand, you were never a mistake, you were never broken. You are the small surprise that has kept the rest of us awake and ready. A tiny, ancient piece of balance carried quietly in your hands. Whichever hand reached first, it was always going to be that one, and that is a strangely comforting thing to know.